Hey everyone, my name is Prince, and welcome back to another video talking about COD Zombies. Now this video is going to be a bit of a pilot episode, I guess, for a series in which I'll be going from the beginning of World at War all the way to the end of Black Ops 4 and explaining the story of every single map. So this will include going over how each individual map fits into the story of COD Zombies, as well as discussing a few other little details about each map. And of course, for the first video in this series, we're going to be starting at the very start. Today we're going to be talking about the map that started it all, the one, the only, NACHT DER UNTOTEN. Translating from German to English as Night of the Undead, NACHT DER UNTOTEN was originally nothing more than an unannounced bonus mode for people that beat the World at War campaign. After finishing the final mission of the campaign, players would be automatically thrust into this mysterious game mode where they would play as 4 random Marines holding off in a German bunker against endless waves of the undead. But what started off as a simple bonus mode would eventually grow into an incredible story of monsters, magic, and an endless fight against the undead that was adored by millions. Now obviously at the time there was no story for NACHT DER UNTOTEN, but as zombies progressed, Treyarch obviously had to integrate it into the existing zombie storyline. So I think we should start by turning to the Chronorium and reading the entry that describes the events of NACHT DER UNTOTEN. For those of you who don't know, the Chronorium is a magical book within the story of COD Zombies, containing the entire history of the multiverse from the perspective of whoever's reading it. But a single page of the Chronorium was actually released by Treyarch, which contained the entire timeline of the zombie storyline from the beginning of World at War all the way to the end of Black Ops 3. It doesn't actually contain the events of Black Ops 4 because at the time when this released, Black Ops 4 hadn't even been made yet, and it would have been a bit weird to include the events of Black Ops 4 on the timeline considering we hadn't experienced those maps yet. But the majority of the story is contained within this page of the Chronorium that was gifted to us by Treyarch. So the entry in the Chronorium describing NACHT DER UNTOTEN says the following: June 4th, 1945, NACHT DER UNTOTEN. An allied plane malfunctions over an airfield and crashes. German army trucks transporting the undead and Element 115 between Group 935 facilities is struck in the crash. The Marines surviving the crash hold out against the undead as long as they can. Now I'm also going to be going over all of the level descriptions / mission briefings for each of the maps, and the one for NACHT is actually pretty creepy. You drove them deep into the heart of the Reich. You thought they were dead. You were wrong. And I really do like that mission briefing because I think it really speaks to the sort of mysterious feel of NACHT, especially when it first came out, obviously. Because this was something that no one had any idea, you know, like what it meant or why it was here. So this is a really fitting description for the beginning of COD Zombies, something really ominous and mysterious and creepy. So due to how little an effect NACHT DER UNTOTEN actually has on most of the overarching story, its entry in the Chronorium is pretty short. So a lot of the finer details aren't really talked about in this entry, so let's go further in and talk about them. The events of NACHT DER UNTOTEN took place on June 4th, 1945. During this time, Group 935 were working for Nazi Germany and were attempting to create a zombie army for them by combining Element 115 with corpses of the deceased. Over the past year, Maxis has been overseeing the development of the undead army personally, but despite new success the previous year, he believes that the zombies themselves cannot actually be fully controlled. Now, the location of NACHT DER UNTOTEN is a little inconsistent, actually in more ways than one, because some sources suggest that it takes place on Peleliu Island because it was based on the World at War multiplayer map Airfield. Some sources suggest it takes place in German-occupied Europe. Other sources suggest it takes place somewhere in Germany. But if I had to give you a concrete answer, NACHT is a German bunker, so I'd probably say that it's somewhere in Germany. So in Germany, on June 4th, 1945, there was a series of German army trucks which were transporting the undead and Element 115 between different Group 935 facilities. However, on this day, there was an allied plane that was flying above that malfunctioned and crashed into the trucks. Now, the Chronorium simply says that the Marines surviving the crash hold out against the undead, undead, so it's never specifically stated how many survived. Most people would simply say that 4 Marines survived, because those are the 4 that we play as in NACHT. But after doing a bit of research, I think there was actually 5 survivors. Because unlike all of the other World at War maps, NACHT actually had an intro cutscene, something that wouldn't return until 5 in Black Ops 1. And in that cutscene, we can see someone, presumably one of the Marines that survived the crash, on the ground as the zombies run towards them. And it really doesn't look like the person we're seeing this perspective from got away from the zombies. Then again, this could have been one of the Germans that were driving the trucks, because obviously there had to have been living Germans that were driving the trucks that were transporting the Element 115 and the undead before the plane crashed. But given that obviously we play as the Marines and we're seeing this from a first-person perspective, I'd say that more likely than not, this is actually one of the Marines. Now, you could say that just before this zombie ran up to this dude and killed him, one of the other Marines shot it and pulled him away to safety. So the number of Marines that actually survived the crash is a little unclear. But we know that only 4 Marines survived the crash and the subsequent appearance of the zombies before making it to NACHT. So 4 surviving American Marines made their way to the abandoned German bunker. There, they found mysterious chalk drawings and a magical box that gave them weapons. Now, it's never really been stated why the chalk drawings and the mystery box are there, because for those of you who don't know, the only reason that the chalk drawings and the mystery box, as well as the perks, appear in all of the places that they do is because Dr. Monty is putting them there. And he usually only does this for people who are of significance to the timeline, because the entire zombie storyline is one big cycle, and Dr. Monty wants to make sure that the cycle continues. So whether it's Ultimus, Primus, Victus, or even the crew from the Pentagon, Monty gives them these tools to survive because they are necessary to the cycle. But I really can't see any reason as to why these 4 random Marines are necessary to the timeline. I don't believe that the outbreak of zombies near that airfield had any lasting consequences on anything throughout the timeline. So it's a little weird that Monty decided to give the mystery box and the chalk drawings to these random Marines that really don't even matter. So that's another mystery from zombies that was never really revealed as far as I know. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments. But speaking of Monty, in the Zombie Chronicles remastered version of NACHT DER UNTOTEN, we actually have a radio from him that talks about NACHT DER UNTOTEN. And this actually potentially reveals something a little interesting. So let's have a listen.
NACHT DER UNTOTEN. That translates as Night of the Dead. I learned that tonight. Been trying to scrub up on my German, you see. Anyway, it happened in an old concrete building on an airfield somewhere in, I don't know where. I remember it being really small, simple by today's standards. I think there was a fog. Not a lot of it, certainly not coming into the building itself. You know what I just realized? You weren't even there. At least, not at first. It was some other random, forgettable soldiers that had the misfortune to live through that horrible night. Or Nacht, as it was actually known. Yeah, I speak German now.
Now, obviously, there are a few little funny references in that radio describing the fact that NACHT is simple in comparison to today's zombies maps. But the most interesting thing is that Monty says that the people that were there at NACHT were not actually Ultimus or Primus, but it was some random forgivable soldiers that had the misfortune to live through that horrible night. Now, what's interesting is the specific phrase he uses to describe these soldiers' experience in NACHT. He says, soldiers that had the misfortune to live through that horrible night. Now, the reason this is so interesting is because for a very long time, we were under the impression that all 4 of the Marines that were in NACHT actually died. We thought that these 4 random Marines made their way to the German bunker, they held out as long as they could, and then they were killed. But the way Dr. Monty's describing them here, it actually sounds like maybe they didn't die. Now, granted, the phrase live through doesn't necessarily mean they survived, because when Monty says they had the misfortune to live through that night, he could just be saying that, you know, that night was part of their lives, and so that's not specifically confirming that they survived. But I feel like if they did die, Monty actually would have commented on that. From the way that Monty usually talks about things, he probably would have said something like, they didn't last very long, poor bastards, or, you know, something like that. But the fact that Treyarch had him use that specific phrase, had the misfortune to live through that horrible night, if they were trying to say that those Marines died, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have used that phrase. Because that really does sound like Monty's trying to say that those 4 Marines actually did live through that night. And if you think about it, living through that night doesn't actually seem like that much of a stretch for these 4 Marines. Because something that was actually pointed out to me recently in the comments of my COD Zombies All Eye Colors video, which I'm sure most of you have probably seen by now, but if you haven't already, go check it out. But I actually said that Samantha was in control of the zombies during NACHT DER UNTOTEN, and that's not actually true, because NACHT DER UNTOTEN takes place on June 4th of 1945, but Samantha wouldn't go into the MPD and gain control of the zombies until October 13th of 1945. So that means that the zombies in NACHT DER UNTOTEN weren't actually being controlled by anyone. And to be honest, that raises even more questions about the eye colors of the zombies, because my assumption was always that when they're not being controlled by anyone, they don't have any glowing eyes at all. But in fairness, NACHT was made at a time when they didn't have the whole eye color and Samantha in control of the zombies storyline planned out yet. And even in the remaster, I think they wanted to be faithful to the original, so they just kept the yellow eye color. But personally, I still maintain that the eye color of the zombies when they're not being controlled by anyone is probably that they don't have any eye color at all. But again, that's, you know, that's never been confirmed, and there are a few inconsistencies with that, as I described in this video, and again, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. But the reason I made this point is because for most of the maps, the only reason the zombies are there is because whoever's in control of them is sending them after a particular group. Throughout all of Black Ops 1, the only reason the zombies were in each of the maps was because Samantha was sending them after Richthofen. And throughout all of Black Ops 2, apart from Mob of the Dead and Origins, the only reason that the zombies were chasing the Victor's crew was because Richthofen was telling them to. Because Richthofen wanted to keep them moving, because if they felt safe, then they wouldn't listen to him. But during the time of NACHT DER UNTOTEN, there was no one controlling the zombies, meaning that the only zombies that would be attacking these Marines would be the undead that were in the trucks. And I know that obviously for gameplay purposes, the zombies are endless, but within the story, there surely wouldn't actually be that many zombies. I guess you could say that if they were within an area of no man's land or somewhere where there had been a lot of extensive fighting and there were a bunch of other corpses as well, then the 115 would also resurrect them. But if you really think about it, there wouldn't actually be that many zombies for the Marines to fight off. So actually thinking about it, the Marines surviving that night isn't actually that much of a stretch, because they had the chalk drawings and they had the mystery box, so they essentially had infinite weapons, so I don't think it's that much of a stretch to say that they actually did survive. And plus, as I read earlier, the Chronorium itself doesn't actually say that they died. It simply says that the Marines surviving the crash hold out against the undead as long as they can. Now, you could infer from it saying as long as they can that eventually they did get overrun, but I'll say it, the way Monty describes the events of NACHT DER UNTOTEN, combined with the fact that there probably wouldn't be that many undead. I guess it depends on how many trucks there were, I don't think we were ever told, but I think it's entirely likely that these Marines actually could have survived. God knows what they did if they actually did survive after NACHT, but maybe they did. Now, there's one more thing that I want to briefly talk about in reference to the story of NACHT, and that's the loading screens. Because in one of the many remasters of NACHT, specifically the one that was featured in Black Ops 1, instead of the original cutscene, it actually featured a comic book loading screen similar to most of the other maps at the time. And this comic book loading screen is a really weird one that doesn't really fit into anything that happens in NACHT. It features a bunch of dates, 1964, 1959, and 1943, none of which are actually the year that NACHT actually takes place in, and a bunch of weird pictures of people seemingly getting hypnotized, people walking in line, and boxes with the Soviet Union flag on. And honestly, to this day, I don't think we have any explanation as to what any of the things in this loading screen mean. The bottom panel and the top panel I thought could be something to do with 935 trying to control the zombies through different means, but nothing else on this loading screen makes any sense to me. In fact, there seems to be a dude stepping out of a rift in the bottom right, and all of those numbers around him actually reminds me of the Pentagon thief from 5. So I have no idea what any of the stuff in this loading screen actually means. But speaking of remakes, as the first map ever made, NACHT has been given no shortage of remakes. If I'm not mistaken, there's actually been more iterations of NACHT than any other map in Zombies history. We had the original version in World at War, we had the remaster in Black Ops 1, it was on Call of Duty Zombies on the iPhone, it was in Black Ops 2 as an Easter egg on Transit. It was in Black Ops 3 twice in both Revelations and as its own remaster in Zombie Chronicles. It was in the pre-alpha of Call of Duty Mobile, and it was in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War twice, both as its own map in Die Machine and as a bonus minigame in Forsaken. Which means that we've seen NACHT DER UNTOTEN 9 different times throughout the history of COD Zombies, and honestly, that's pretty wild. Also, speaking of Call of Duty Zombies on the iPhone, there is one thing that I should probably mention. Apparently, the NACHT DER UNTOTEN on there actually had a tutorial featuring Richtofen, and one of the Marines was actually named Rook. Apparently, Richtofen was actually part of the tutorial on that map, and Rook actually had to kill him after he turned into a zombie. All of that honestly sounds insane, and I think we can safely say that it isn't canon. But hey, maybe that means that one of the Marines' names is actually Rook. Now, the version of NACHT that appears in Transit in Black Ops 2 is probably something I should briefly mention, because NACHT is obviously supposedly in Germany, and it's very weird that it randomly appeared in America. I don't think we ever got a confirmed answer as to why NACHT is there in Transit. Some people think that it was due to dimensional distortions and that NACHT was actually teleported into Transit. Other people believe that it was built as a sort of military practice site to practice infiltrating German buildings. Honestly, I think you could go for either explanation. Personally, I'm more inclined to believe the dimensional displacement theory, especially considering we've actually seen that before with maps like Buried. Now, I should also mention that in both the Black Ops 1 version and the Black Ops 3 version of NACHT, we don't actually play as these Marines again. Instead, we actually play as the Ultimus crew, and the Black Ops 3 version of this is actually canon. Now, it's not canon to the main timeline, but it did factually take place in a different universe. And I did want to briefly talk about this, because this is something that people get a little bit confused about. Because a lot of people are under the impression that the version of NACHT that has the Ultimus crew is a fracture. For those of you who don't know, a fracture is basically a term in COD Zombies where events happen differently thanks to something happening in the timeline. It's basically an alternate timeline. An alternate timeline that branches off from the main timeline where things happen differently. Now, this is different from an alternate dimension or universe, and in COD Zombies, dimension and universe are one and the same, such as Dimension 63, which is where the premise characters are from. That's an entirely different universe. To put it simply, there are alternate dimensions slash universes where things happened completely differently than they did in the original universe, and then there are fractures, which is where the event events of the original universe are changed and distorted thanks to something fucking up the timeline, basically. There are three main fractures in the Zombies universe, which are the Deceptio fracture, the Prodatone fracture, and the Agonia fracture. And all three of those resulted from Primus Richtofen going forwards in time to kill Ultimus Richtofen. Killing Ultimus Richtofen drastically changed the timeline, but I'm not really going to go into all of that because we'll definitely talk about that in future videos on future maps. Now, the reason I'm saying all of this is because a lot of people seem to be under the impression that the version of NACHT in Black Ops 3 where the Ultimus crew are present is actually a fracture. And plain and simple, I don't think that's actually possible. Because every single fracture that we know of is caused by Primus Richtofen going forward in time and killing his Ultimus self. And we actually see in one of the modified loading screens that because Ultimus Richtofen was killed by Primus Richtofen, NACHT DER UNTOTEN actually didn't happen. Now, how this actually makes sense, I'm not entirely certain, because NACHT actually takes place before the point in time where Ultimus Richtofen is killed. So I'm not entirely sure how killing Ultimus Richtofen means that the original NACHT DER UNTOTEN didn't happen. Because like I said, the events of NACHT DER UNTOTEN, where the Marines crash landed near the airfield and held out in the bunker, happened way before the events that led to Ultimus Richtofen getting killed by Primus Richtofen. But this absolutely means that the Black Ops 3 version of NACHT cannot be a fracture, because the version of NACHT in Black Ops 3 contains Richtofen and the rest of the Ultimus crew. And thanks to Primus Richtofen killing his Ultimus self, the Ultimus crew never get together. Ultimus Dempsey is sent to Griffin Station, Ultimus Tachio was never captured by Group 935, and Ultimus Nikolai was never captured because during the Agonia fracture, he's still fighting in World War II. Because in the Agonia fracture, Nikolai is fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad because in the Agonia fracture, World War II never ended. So the Black Ops 3 version of NACHT cannot be a fracture because it relies on the Ultimus crew getting together. And the only reason the Ultimus crew got together was because after betraying Samantha and Maxis, as he did moments before Primus Richtofen killed him, Ultimus Richtofen awakened the test subjects, which were Ultimus Dempsey, Nikolai, and Tachio, and formed the Ultimus crew. So for that reason, the Black Ops 3 version of NACHT cannot be a fracture and seemingly takes place in a different universe where for some reason Ultimus ended up in NACHT. Why this would be, I have no idea. I don't see any reason they'd want to come to NACHT on purpose, so I'd say that like the Marines, it may have been an accident. Maybe one time instead of taking a rift or a lunar lander from one location to another during the events of Black Ops 1, they actually decided to take a plane and ended up crashing near that airfield. And maybe they were carrying some 115 in their plane that made the zombies. I don't know, I don't think we'll ever get an answer as to what that universe's version of Ultimus were doing in NACHT, but it's pretty cool to think about. And if I'm not mistaken, the NACHT DER UNTOTEN crew of these 4 random Marines are actually the only crew that we basically know nothing about. We don't know their names, we don't know their backstories, and we don't even know whether they survived or not. And it's a real shame that the terrible direction that Zombies has gone nowadays means that we probably won't ever see these characters again. Because if what Dr. Monty was saying in that radio in the remaster actually means that the crew of the original NACHT did survive, I would love to see a sequel map with these same characters in a different location. Because that's something that I think was a really big missed opportunity for Zombies. It was something mentioned by Black Ops Amazing on one of his Q&As, but it would have been really cool if we'd have gotten a bunch of maps or maybe even an entire game based on crews and events within the Zombies timeline that weren't necessarily integral to the story. Because funnily enough, there's actually quite a few different crews that this could apply to. They could do a map focused on the Marines from NACHT DER UNTOTEN again. We could have had a map focused around what happened to the Call of the Dead crew after Call of the Dead, because it was never actually revealed what happened to them after that map. We could have had a map focused around the group known as the Flesh during Black Ops 2, which is, if you don't know, a group that actually ate the zombie flesh that Samuel Stuhlinger from the Transit crew was actually a part of. Like Nuketown from Black Ops 2 is a fantastic example, because that map featured the CDC and the CIA investigating Nuketown just before the rockets from Moon hit the Earth. That map was wasn't necessarily essential to the story, but it was a cool little side story about a group of characters that weren't necessarily essential to the story. Now, I don't think we'll ever actually get an answer as to whether or not those 4 unnamed Marines actually survived the Night of the Dead, but honestly, after so many years of believing that they were dead, I think it's a nice idea to entertain the fact that maybe they did survive, and that they continued to kick ass against the zombies until they actually won the day. And who knows, maybe they're still out there and they made it home to their families. And honestly, I think a happy ending for these characters is something nice to consider. Anyway, I really hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and go join both the casual Discord, which is the Discord I use to let you guys know whenever I'm uploading or going live, and the COD Zombies unofficial Discord, the links to both of which are in the description down below. If this video does indeed turn out to be successful, then of course we'll continue it as a series, and next episode we'll be moving on to Verrückt. So again, thanks a lot for watching everyone, and I will see you on another video or stream very, very soon. Goodbye everyone.